Her knuckles were white as she desperately gripped the silk of the stranger's expensive jacket. Tears cut paths through the red grime on her cheeks, her voice cracking with terror. "They're hurting my mom. Please." The music in the lounge died instantly. Crystal glasses were set down with a sharp clink. Every pair of eyes in the VIP section locked onto them. But the man she had just grabbed wasn't a hero. He was Nicholas, the ruthlessly efficient head of the Korean syndicate, and the most dangerous predator in the city. And what he did next didn't just break the rules of the underworld. It froze the streets entirely. Stick around, because the choice he makes in this moment changes everything. Before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the Edge. Now, let's go back to moments before the chaos. It's a rainy Friday night in the neon heart of the metropolis. The Onyx room was thick with expensive cigar smoke and the murmur of power. This wasn't just a club. It was Nicholas's sanctuary. The staff knew the drill, eyes down, mouth shut. The patrons knew the law. You pay your respects, and you never, ever interrupt the boss. Nicholas sat in the center booth, an athletic figure in a sharp black suit, shirt unbuttoned just enough to show the gold chain against his chest. At 42, he ran the city's shadows with a terrifying calm. The small tattoo on his neck was a warning label that everyone understood. He was conducting business with his top enforcers. Eyes alert, calculating, posture relaxed but dominant. Nicholas didn't do messy. He did surgical. He believed that in this life, empathy was a liability, and liabilities got you buried. But then, the one thing Nicholas couldn't calculate came crashing through his defenses. The heavy, soundproof doors of the VIP lounge burst open, slamming against the velvet walls. The security team tensed, hands fly to their holsters, expecting a raid. But before they could draw their weapons, they froze. A little girl, no older than 7, stood trembling in the entryway. Her bright pink dress was torn. Her face was smeared with red. She looked like she had just run through a war zone to get here. And she wasn't looking for the police. She was looking for him. The Onyx room didn't just smell of aged scotch and Cuban cigar smoke. It smelled of silence. In the heart of the metropolis, where the streets outside screamed with sirens and neon chaos, this private lounge was a vacuum. Sound didn't travel here. It died. And it died because Nicholas willed it so. He sat in the center of the velvet booth, a dark anchor in a room of shifting shadows. At 42, Nicholas looked less like a criminal and more like a weapon kept in a velvet case. His black suit jacket was tailored to perfection, hugging broad shoulders that carried the weight of the city's underworld without slumping. Beneath it, his black shirt was unbuttoned at the top, eschewing a tie for a casual dominance that said he didn't need to dress up for anyone. A heavy gold chain rested against his chest, catching the low amber light, a stark contrast to the small, intricate tattoo inked into the side of his neck. It was a serpent, coiled and waiting, a permanent warning label for anyone foolish enough to get too close. Across the marble table, 3 of his top lieutenants sat with their backs straight, their hands folded neatly in front of them. They were dangerous men, killers, thieves, extortionists. But in Nicholas's presence, they looked like scolded schoolboys. One of them, a heavy-set man named Kong, was sweating, despite the room's aggressive air conditioning. He pushed a thick envelope across the cold surface of the table. The sound of the paper sliding was deafening in the quiet. Nicholas didn't look at the money. His dark eyes, calm and calculating, remained fixed on Kang's trembling fingers. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, the ice clinking softly against the glass. "The docks are clear," Kong whispered, his voice cracking. "We handled the issue with the customs officer." Nicholas didn't nod. He didn't smile. He simply stared, dissecting the man's fear. This was his domain, a kingdom built on the absolute certainty that he could reach anyone, anywhere. He had survived the climb to the top by adhering to a code that was as simple as it was brutal. Trust was a disease, and emotion was a symptom that killed you. He had seen what happened to men who loved. He had seen rivals buried with their wives. Empires crumbled because a boss hesitated to pull the trigger on a friend. Nicholas had surgically removed those weaknesses from his life years ago. He had no wife, no children, no friends. He had assets and liabilities. He had soldiers and enemies, To feel was to bleed, and Nicholas Torino did not bleed. "Leave it," Nicholas said finally. His voice was a low rumble, smooth but laced with an underlying threat, like a luxury car idling before a race. Kong exhaled, the relief palpable, and pulled his hand back as if the table had burned him. Nicholas leaned back, one arm draping casually over the back of the booth. He was the king of the shadows, a man who had turned his heart into a fortress of ice. He scanned the room, noting the position of every guard, the exit routes, the reflection in the glass. He was perfectly alone, and that was exactly how he liked it. In this world of wolves, he was a tiger, solitary, silent, and untouchable. Nothing entered this room without his permission. Nothing disrupted his peace. Or so he thought. The silence of the onyx room didn't break. It shattered. The double mahogany doors, reinforced with steel and guarded by the best men money could buy, flew open with a violence that shook the crystal glasses on the tables. The sound was a thunderclap, a jarring intrusion that caused the air pressure in the room to spike instantly. In a fraction of a second, the atmosphere shifted from low-simmering tension to active combat readiness. The 3 lieutenants at the table flinched, their hands diving inside their jackets. The perimeter guards, standing like statues in the corners, were already moving, their bodies forming a protective wall between the entrance and Nicholas. Hands hovered over holsters, eyes scanning for the muzzle flash of an assassin's rifle or the tactical gear of a raid team. They expected a hit squad. They expected the police. They expected a rival gang coming to claim the crown. They did not expect a child. Standing in the doorway, framed by the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway behind her, was a tiny, trembling figure. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. She looked as though she had been spat out by a hurricane. Her hair, a soft tumble of light brown curls with straight bangs that usually framed a sweet face, was a mess of tangles and sweat. She wore a bright pink dress, a shocking splash of innocence against the room's palette of black, charcoal, and blood-red velvet. But the hem was torn and gray with street grime. One of her small white socks had slid down to her ankle, but it was her face that froze the room. Her cheeks were wet, streaked with fresh tears that cut through dirt, but beneath the tears were smeary, jagged red marks. They looked like blood, or perhaps paint, dragged across her pale skin in a chaotic struggle. Her mouth hung slightly open, gasping for air, her chest heaving with the exertion of a desperate sprint. Her eyes were wide, panic saucers darting around the dimly lit lounge, searching for safety in a room designed for danger. "Secure the target," one of the guards barked, his voice rough with confusion and adrenaline. He stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the light, reaching out to grab the girl's shoulder and remove the anomaly. To him, she wasn't a child. She was a security breach. The girl flinched, shrinking back against the doorframe, a whimper catching in her throat. "Hold." The command was soft, barely a whisper, but it cut through the room with more force than the slamming doors. Nicholas hadn't moved from his seat. He hadn't reached for a weapon. He hadn't flinched. He simply sat there, his whiskey glass still in his hand, his dark eyes locked onto the girl. He raised his free hand, palm out, fingers spread slightly. It was a gesture of absolute authority. The guard froze mid-step, his hand inches from the girl's arm. He looked back at his boss, confusion warring with obedience. Nicholas didn't look at the guard. He stared at the red marks on the girl's face. He studied the terror in her posture, the way she vibrated with fear. In his world, people broke in to kill, to steal, or to spy. No one broke into the onyx room to cry. He lowered his hand slowly, signaling the men to stand down. The guards hesitated, then stepped back, leaving the path between the king of the shadows and the terrified intruder wide open. She moved before anyone could breathe. Jojo didn't see the guns, the scars, or the cold calculation in the eyes of the men surrounding her. She only saw the man in the center, the one everyone else had stepped away from. Instinct, raw and desperate, told her that the eye of the storm was the only safe place left. She sprinted across the marble floor, her small sneakers squeaking against the polished stone, closing the distance between the world of victims and the world of predators. Nicholas watched her come. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He sat as still as a statue, waiting for collision. It happened in a blur of pink and motion. Jojo crashed into the booth, her momentum carrying her right up to him. Without a shred of hesitation, she reached out and grabbed his arm. The contact was electric. Her tiny fingers, sticky with grime and sweat, clamped on the forearm of his immaculate black suit jacket. She squeezed with a strength born of pure terror, her knuckles pressing into the expensive Italian silk. Underneath the fabric, Nicholas's muscle was tense, hard as iron, but he didn't pull away. The room seemed to inhale. Touching Nicholas Torino was a death sentence. Men had lost fingers for less. The lieutenant stared in horrified fascination, waiting for the backhand, the shout, the signal to the guard to drag this insolent disruption away. But Nicholas just looked down. He looked at the small hand marring his perfect suit. He felt the tremors running through her body, vibrating into his own arm like a current. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in decades, pure, unfiltered reliance. She wasn't trying to bargain with him. She wasn't trying to intimidate him. She was holding on to him because she believed he was the only thing in the world that wouldn't break. Jojo looked up, her neck craning to meet his gaze. Her wide, brown eyes were swimming in tears, the red marks on her cheeks stark and angry under the lounge lights. "They're hurting my mom," she whispered. The voice was tiny, a fractured sound that barely carried over hum of the air conditioning. But to Nicholas, it was louder than a gunshot. "They're hurting my mom." It wasn't a plea for money. It wasn't a beg for mercy. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a devastating expectation that he would fix it. Nicholas looked into those terrified eyes and saw the reflection of a world he had tried to burn down. He saw the vulnerability he despised, the weakness he had purged from his own soul. But looking at her, he didn't feel disgust. He felt a sudden, violent surge of something ancient, something dormant. Rage. Not the cold, calculated anger of business, but the hot, red fury of protection. He moved. Nicholas stood up. The motion was so abrupt, so fluid and powerful, that Kong actually flinched back in his seat. The relaxed, bored king was gone. In his place stood a warlord. "Tony," Nicholas said. His voice was terrifyingly calm, but it held a dark edge that made the hair on the back of his lieutenant's neck stand up. "Get the car." Tony, the head of security, blinked, a professional mask slipping. "Boss?" "The meeting, the encroaching territory." "The meeting is over," Nicholas said, his eyes never leaving the girl's face. He turned his wrist, not to shake her off, but to encompass her hand in his own large one. "We have a new priority." The men exchanged panicked glances. This was insanity. Leaving a sit-down with his top earners to chase a vague threat from a crying child? It was impulsive. It was emotional. It was everything Nicholas Torino was not. And that was what terrified them the most. If the man of ice had started to burn, the whole city was about to catch fire. The convoy moved like a viper striking through high grass. Swift, silent, and deadly. 3 armored SUVs flanked Nicholas's black sedan as they tore out of the club's private garage and onto the rain-slicked streets. The city blurred past the tinted windows, a streak of neon blue and red. But inside the car, the air was heavy and still. Nicholas sat in the back, his posture rigid. Beside him, Jojo looked impossibly small against the diamond-stitched leather seats. She hadn't let go. Her small hand was still balled into a fist around the fabric of his jacket, her knuckles white. She stared out the window, her breath hitching in small, rhythmic gasps that sounded painfully loud in the quiet cabin. Tony, behind the wheel, drove with the cold precision of a man who knew that a single mistake meant death. He wove the heavy car through traffic, running red lights with a calculated aggression that sent other drivers swerving out of the way. 3 minutes out, Tony announced, his eyes flicking to the rear-view mirror. He looked at Nicholas, then at the girl, his expression tight. "Boss, this neighborhood, it's Viper territory. It's messy." "I don't care who claims the pavement," Nicholas said, his voice dropping an octave. "Just get us to the door." He looked down at Jojo. She wasn't looking at the city lights anymore. She was looking at her knees, her legs swinging slightly, unable to touch the floor mat. She looked fragile, like a porcelain doll dropped in the mud. Nicholas felt a strange, tightening sensation in his chest, a protective instinct he hadn't felt since he was a young soldier protecting his own younger brother. That brother was long dead, buried by the same life Nicholas now ruled. "We're here," Tony said, breaking the trance. The scenery had shifted. The high-rises and luxury boutiques were gone, replaced by crumbling brick tenements and flickering street lamps. This was the sprawl, a graveyard of ambition where the city's forgotten tried to survive. The convoy screeched to a halt in front of a dilapidated apartment block. The pavement was cracked, weeds growing through the fissures like veins. Before the car had fully stopped, the security team was out, securing the perimeter with practiced efficiency. Nicholas opened his door and stepped out into the humid night air. He didn't wait for security to clear the path. He extended a hand back into the car. Jojo took it immediately, sliding off the seat and gripping his fingers as if they were a lifeline. "Show me," Nicholas said. She led him toward the entrance. The front door of the building was propped open with a cinder block. The hallway smelled of stale beer and mildew. They moved quickly, Jojo half running to keep up with Nicholas's long strides, pulling him toward a ground-floor unit at the end of the hall. There was no need for a key. The door to apartment 1B was smashed inward, the wood splintered around the lock, hanging crookedly on bent hinges. Nicholas signaled his men to hold back. He stepped over the threshold first, shielding Jojo with his body until he cleared the room. It was a small, cramped space, cluttered but clean, or it had been. Now, a table was overturned. A lamp lay shattered on the floor. "Mommy?" Jojo's voice was a high, thin wail. She pushed past Nicholas's leg and ran toward the kitchenette. Lying on the linoleum floor, amid scattered mail and broken glass, was a woman. She was young, her hair the same light brown as Jojo's, fanned out around her head like a halo. But the halo was stained dark. She wasn't moving. Jojo dropped to her knees, shaking her mother's shoulder. Mommy, wake up. I brought him. I brought the man." Nicholas crossed the room in 2 strides. He knelt beside the woman, his expensive suit soaking up the grime of the floor. He placed 2 fingers against her neck, pressing past the bruising that darkened her throat. For a terrifying second, there was nothing. Then, faint and thready, he felt it. A pulse. She was alive. But looking at the devastation in the room and the pallor of her skin, Nicholas knew that the clock wasn't just ticking. It was running out. Code red. Level 1. Bring the trauma kit. Nicholas didn't wait for an answer. He crushed the phone back into his pocket and turned to his men. "Clear the hallway. I want a perimeter established on the street. No cops, no neighbors. If anyone asks, it's a gas leak." Tony nodded, his face grim, and vanished into the corridor to enforce the silence. The wait felt like hours, but it was barely 6 minutes before the heavy boots of the extraction team thudded against the floorboards. Dr. Aris, a man who had stitched up more bullet holes in the back of nightclubs than in operating theaters, swept into the room. He was flanked by 2 assistants carrying tactical medical gear. "Stabilize and transport," Nicholas ordered, stepping back to give them space. "She's fading." The room erupted into controlled chaos. Velcro ripped, oxygen tanks hissed, and urgent, hushed commands flew between the medics. They were efficient, brutal in their speed, cutting away the woman's shirt to attach leads, sliding a needle into her arm, securing her neck with a brace. In the corner, Jojo had stopped screaming. She was pressed against the peeling wallpaper, her small body rigid. Her hands were clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide and unblinking as she watched the strangers swarm her mother. She wasn't crying anymore. She was catatonic. The terror had overloaded her system, freezing her in place like a statue of grief. Nicholas saw the change. He saw the way her breathing had become shallow, almost non-existent. He knew that look. It was a look of a soul breaking under the weight of trauma it couldn't process. He turned his back on the medical team and walked toward her. He didn't tower over her. He didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, Nicholas Torino, the man who made grown men tremble by walking into a room, lowered himself. He crouched down until his knees hit the dirty linoleum, bringing his face level with hers. He waited until her eyes unlocked from the scene on the floor and drifted to him. "Jojo," he said. His voice was different now, deeper, softer, stripped to the jagged edges he used for the world. Look at me. She blinked, a single tear escaping the track through the dirt on her cheek. I need you to listen, he said, holding her gaze with an intensity that blocked out the rest of the room. The doctors are going to take care of your mom. They are the best in the city. She is going to be okay. She won't wake up, Jojo whispered, her voice trembling. She will, Nicholas said. He didn't say maybe. He didn't say hopefully. He spoke with the absolute, unshakable confidence of a man who controlled reality. I am going to take you to a safe place. There are toys there and food and warm beds. No one can hurt you there. He reached out and gently took her small, cold hands in his. I give you my word, he said, squeezing her fingers. I will fix this. Jojo stared at him, searching his face for a lie. She found none. Slowly, the rigidity left her shoulders. She nodded, a tiny, jerky motion. Nicholas stood up, the softness vanishing from his eyes as he turned to his head of security. Take her to the safe house. Put a detail on the door. If she sheds one more tear because she's scared, you answer to me. Yes, boss. As the medics lifted Jojo's mother onto the stretcher and the security team ushered the little girl out into the waiting car, Nicholas remained in the empty, broken apartment. He looked at the overturned table. He looked at the blood on the floor. The guardian was gone. The predator was back. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over a contact. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to panic. He just needed a name. Tony, he said into the silence of the room. Find them. The warehouse smelled of rust, brackish water, and impending violence. It was a hollowed-out carcass of industry on the edge of the river, a place where the city's secrets went to rot. Inside, the only light came from a single halogen work lamp, casting long, distorted shadows against the peeling concrete walls. Two young men sat zip-tied to heavy steel chairs in the center of the vast, empty floor. They were vipers, low-level street muscle wearing cheap leather and smelling of stale smoke and anxiety. One had a split lip. The other was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically toward the dark corners where Nicholas's security team stood like silent wraiths. You can't keep us here, the one with the split lip spat, though his voice cracked on the last word. You know who we run with? The Vipers don't. The heavy metal door at the far end of the warehouse rolled open. The sound was a low, grinding roar that swallowed the thug's defiance instantly. Nicholas walked in. He looked different. The impeccable suit jacket was gone, left in the car. His black shirt was unbuttoned at the cuffs. The sleeves rolled up to his elbows with precise, military folds, revealing thick forearms corded with muscle. The gold chain still glinted against his chest, but the air of a sophisticated businessman had evaporated. What remained was pure, distilled violence. He didn't rush. He walked with slow, predatory rhythm, his dress shoes clicking softly against the concrete. Every step echoed, a countdown ticking toward zero. The thugs fell silent. They had expected a shouting match. They had expected threats, cursing, the chaotic noise of a street brawl. They didn't know how to handle the quiet. Nicholas stopped 5 feet in front of them. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, his hands hanging loose at his sides, and watched them. His expression was a blank slate. No anger, no hate, just a terrifyingly empty calm. It was the look of a butcher inspecting a side of beef, calculating the best place to make the first cut. The hyperventilating thug broke first. Look, man, we didn't know. It was just a collection. She owed money. Nicholas tilted his head slightly, as if listening to a distant frequency. He stepped closer, invading their personal space until he towered over the speaker. He reached out, his movement slow and deliberate, and brushed a speck of invisible dust from the thug's shoulder. The boy flinched so hard the chair rattled against the floor. A collection, Nicholas repeated softly. His voice was smooth, devoid of any jagged edges. It was far more terrifying than a scream. Is that what you call it when you beat a woman unconscious in front of her child? She resisted. The thug stammered, tears leaking from his eyes now. We had to make a point. Nicholas stared at him. The tattoo on his neck seemed to darken in the halogen light. You made a point, he agreed. And now, I'm going to make a counterpoint. He turned away from them, walking toward a metalwork table where Tony had laid out a series of items. Nicholas ran his hand along the cold steel, his back to the prisoners. The casual dismissal was worse than a blow. It told them they weren't enemies to be fought. They were problems to be solved. And Nicholas Torino solved problems permanently. "You see," Nicholas said to the empty room, "you mistook noise for power. You thought because you could yell and break things, you were in charge." He picked up a heavy wrench, weighing it thoughtfully in his hand. "But you forgot the first rule of the jungle. The loudest animal is usually the first one eaten." He turned back to face them, the wrench resting easily in his grip. He wasn't smiling. "Now," Nicholas whispered, "let's discuss the debt." Nicholas didn't swing the wrench. He didn't need to. He simply tapped against the palm of his left hand. Thud, 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 a metronome counting down the seconds of their lives. "I asked a question," Nicholas said, his voice barely rising above a whisper. "The debt, how much was it?" The thug with the split lip, whose name turned out to be Kilo, looked at his partner, then back at the man standing over them. He swallowed hard, the sound audible in the cavernous silence. It was 400. Nicholas stopped tapping. The silence stretched, thin and agonizing. 400,000? Kilo blinked, sweat dripping from his nose. "No, $400. Nicholas stared at him. For a moment, he looked genuinely confused. He turned his head slightly, as if trying to solve a complex equation, and then a low, dry sound escaped his throat. It took the thugs a moment to realize he was laughing. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a sound of dry leaves crumbling in winter. $400, Nicholas repeated. He walked over to the small metal table and set the wrench down. The metal clang echoed like a gunshot. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold money clip. With a flick of his thumb, he peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills. He let them flutter to the floor at Kilo's feet. They landed softly in the dust and oil stains. "There," Nicholas said. "Debt paid. With interest." The thug stared at the money, paralyzed. "Pick it up," Nicholas commanded. I can't," Kilo stammered, straining against the zip ties cutting into his wrists. "No," Nicholas corrected. "You can't because it doesn't matter anymore. That paper on the floor, that is what you sold your lives for." He began to pace around them, circling like a shark in dark water. "Let's do the math, gentlemen. I am a businessman. After all, you wanted $400. So you broke down a door. That's $200 to replace. You smashed a lamp, $50. You put a woman in the ICU. That's $10,000 in medical bills minimum." He stopped directly behind Kilo's chair, leaning down so his mouth was inches from the boy's ear. "And then there are the intangible costs," Nicholas whispered. "You terrified a 6-year-old girl. You put a mark on her memory that no amount of therapy will ever scrub clean. You took her safety, her innocence, and you crushed it." He walked back around to face them, his expression hardening into stone. "You traded a child's soul for $400. That is simply bad business." Kilo was sobbing now, the bravado completely gone. He realized with a terrifying clarity that he wasn't dealing with a rival gang member who wanted turf. He was dealing with a force of nature who viewed them as a statistical error. "We didn't know," the other thug whimpered. "We just do what Razor tells us." Razor. Nicholas tasted the name, finding it bitter. "Your boss." He wanted the money," he said, make an example. "An example," Nicholas nodded slowly. "Yes, that is a concept I understand." He picked up the wrench again. The thugs flinched, curling it on themselves. But Nicholas didn't strike. He simply held it up, inspecting the heavy iron. "You made a mistake," Nicholas said, his voice dropping to a final, deadly register. "You thought the price of that woman's safety was $400, but you failed to calculate the exchange rate." He tossed the wrench onto the table with a finality that made them jump. "You didn't just hurt a florist," Nicholas said, buttoning his cuffs with slow, deliberate movements. "You declared war on me, and for $400, you bought yourselves a funeral." He turned to Tony, who was standing by the door. Keep them here. Alive. They are going to need to witness the liquidation of their company. Nicholas walked toward the exit, stepping over the money on the floor without a backward glance. The math was done. Now it was time to balance the books. Razor Rodriguez arrived with the swagger of a man who believed his own hype, but the confidence evaporated the moment he stepped into the warehouse office. He had brought 4 bodyguards, but Nicholas's security team had stripped them of their weapons and left them waiting by the loading dock. Razor walked up the metal stairs alone, the sound of his heavy boots ringing hollow against the grate. The office was a glass box overlooking the warehouse floor. Inside, Nicholas stood by the window, looking down at the 2 Vipers still zip-tied to the chairs below. He didn't turn around when Razor entered. "You got a lot of nerve, Torino," Razor spat, though his voice was tight. He was a man of flash, gold teeth, a jacket that cost more than his car, and a reputation built on loud threats. "You grab my boys? You interfere with my collection? This is an act of war." Nicholas turned slowly. The silence in the small room was suffocating. He leaned against the glass, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at Razor not with anger, but with the weary patience of a teacher dealing with a slow student. "War implies 2 armies," Nicholas said softly. "You don't have an army, Razor. You have a fan club with guns." Razor bristled, stepping forward, his hand twitching toward a holster that was no longer there. "I run these streets. That woman owed me money. It's business. You of all people should know." "Stop." The word was a physical barrier. Nicholas pushed off the glass and walked toward the desk that separated them. He placed his hands flat on the surface, leaning in until he occupied Razor's entire field of vision. "You think business is beating a mother until she bleeds into her own carpet? You think business is traumatizing a 6-year-old girl?" Nicholas shook his head, a look of genuine pity crossing his face. "That isn't business. That is sloppy, and I do not tolerate sloppy work in my city." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a hospital invoice printed just 20 minutes ago by his administrative team. He slid it across the desk. "This is the new balance sheet," Nicholas said. Razor looked down at the paper, then back up, confused. "What is this?" "The debt is gone," Nicholas stated, his voice flat and immutable. "The $400? It never existed. Erase it from your books. But we have created a new transaction." He tapped the paper with his index finger. "That figure covers the intensive care unit, the surgery, and the rehabilitation therapy for the woman your men assaulted. It also includes the cost of a new apartment in a secure building, 3 neighborhoods away from here, prepaid for 5 years. Razor's jaw dropped. "You're crazy. That's 6 figures. I ain't paying that." Nicholas didn't blink. He checked his watch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than Razor's entire operation. "It is currently 2:15 a.m., Nicholas said. "My banking associates have set up an escrow account. The routing number is on the bottom of that page." He looked up, locking eyes with the street thug. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "If that money is not in the account by 6 a.m., then at 6:01, the Vipers cease to exist. You can't just—" "I can," Nicholas interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "I will liquidate your assets. I will burn your safe houses. I will hand your routes to the Russians, and I will leave you with nothing but the clothes on your back. If you are lucky." Razor stared at him, searching for a bluff. He found only the cold, hard certainty of a man who controlled the tides. He realized then that he wasn't negotiating. He was being sentenced. 6 a.m., Nicholas repeated, turning back to the window to watch the city lights. "Don't be late. I hate paperwork." The sunlight hit the pavement differently here. In the quiet, tree-lined streets of the suburbs, the light didn't fight through smog or neon. It just fell warm and golden on the neatly trimmed lawns. It was a world away from the Onyx Room, and an entire universe away from the crumbling tenement where Nicholas had found them 6 months ago. Nicholas stood by his black sedan, watching. He wore a suit, as always, charcoal gray today, sharp enough to cut glass, but his stance was looser. His hands weren't hovering near a weapon, and his eyes weren't scanning the perimeter for threats. They were fixed on the playground across the street. JoJo was on the swings. She pushed herself higher and higher, her head thrown back, laughing at the sky. The bruises were long gone, faded into bad memories that Nicholas had paid a small fortune in therapy bills to help erase. Her hair was clean and bouncing the wind, the sunlight turning the light brown curls to gold. She looked like a child again, not a survivor. Sitting on a bench nearby was her mother. She looked healthy, the hollowness in her cheeks filled out, her eyes bright and alert as she watched her daughter. She held a book in her lap. A luxury of leisure she had never been able to afford before the settlement Nicholas had arranged. "Boss," Tony said quietly from the driver's seat, "we have the meeting with the triads at 4. "Let them wait," Nicholas said. Closing the car door, he walked across the street. JoJo saw him first. She didn't freeze. She didn't tremble. She jumped off the swing mid-arc, landing the mulch with a reckless joy that made her mother jump, and then she sprinted toward him. "Nicholas!" She crashed into his legs, wrapping her arms around his tailored trousers. It was the same grip she had used that night in club, fierce, possessive, but the desperation was gone. It was replaced by pure, unadulterated affection. Nicholas looked down, and for a moment, the fearsome crime lord vanished. He placed a hand on her head, careful not to mess up her hair, though he knew she wouldn't care. "You're getting tall," he observed, his voice a low rumble that no longer carried a threat. "Mom says it's the vegetables." JoJo wrinkled her nose, looking up at him. "Did you bring it?" Nicholas reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small velvet-wrapped box. He didn't hand it over immediately. He held it just out of reach, a playful glint in his dark eyes. "Only if you finish your homework." I did math and everything." He handed her the box. She tore it open with zero regard for the expensive packaging. Inside sat a delicate silver charm bracelet with a single charm, a tiny detailed tiger. "A tiger," she breathed, tracing the metal. "Like you, a guardian," Nicholas corrected gently. "So, you remember that you are never walking alone." Her mother walked up then, smiling as she wiped her hands on her jeans. "You spoil her, Nicholas." She was already happy just to see you. "Happiness is fragile," Nicholas said, watching JoJo fasten the bracelet. "I prefer to reinforce it." He looked at the two of them, the family he had accidentally acquired, the weakness he had been so terrified of. He realized now that he had been wrong for 20 years. This wasn't a liability. It was an anchor. It was the one thing that kept him from drowning in the dark water of his own life. JoJo looked up from her wrist, beaming at him with a smile so bright it hurt to look at. "Thank you, Nicholas." And then it happened. The sharp, calculating lines of Nicholas's face shifted. The tension that lived permanently in his jaw released. The corners of his mouth curled upward, not in a smirk of victory or a grimace of violence, but in something genuine. Nicholas Torino smiled. "You're welcome, kid," he said. The King of the Shadows had finally found his light. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe for more incredible true stories that prove humanity still exists in the darkest places.